Hi! So today I'm going to be talking about some books about American imperialism and control that I read. I was always struck by how little I learned about this in school and how most of my knowledge came from my friends' lived experience and just learning on my own until I went to college. That was the first time that I ever learned about this topic in school. It was really interesting to me, so I wanted to learn more in this vlog. So the first book I want to talk about is From a Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii by Hanani K. Trask. And this book was a 5-star read for me. I felt that it did a really great job at capturing issues historically and in the present moment. But this book was written in 1993, so obviously there have been changing circumstances since then, and it made me want to pick up a lot of modern literature about Hawaii. So if you have anything that's been published in the past few years that you've read that you really enjoyed, let me know, because this book is only the start and I want to learn more. So this book talks about Hawaiian cultures and ways of life on the land and governing, and then the way that the arrival of Captain Cook affected them with disease and missionaries and things like that, and then goes into the overthrow of Hawaii. So if you don't know about that subject, there's a good primer for that, and the way that American businessmen and military overthrew the government and the reaction of Americans at the time. And I didn't know about the fact that there was someone hired to come and investigate this, and the person actually sided with Native Hawaiians that this was an unjust takeover. And I guess President Cleveland at the time agreed, but then McKinley came into office and wanted to have a monopoly on resources in Hawaii, so had a different viewpoint. So that was really interesting to read about. President Clinton apologized for this takeover, but there was nothing to this apology in terms of restitution, reparations, any move to correct these wrongs in any way, but the fact that it was acknowledged can be cited in moves to get these things back. So significant and insignificant at the same time. It also talks about the way that even though Hawaii was occupied, there were things written into the law about maintaining resources for Native Hawaiians, but these resources were mismanaged by a white government to the benefit of white residents. So the book details the Kaluhui Master Plan, which is a Native group that arises that has thousands of members, that is trying to have self-determination and establish themselves as a sovereign nation, going back to honoring the international treaties that they had before the overthrow, getting land and resources back, land that's federally and state owned. There is a whole section in the back of the book for the master plan that lays out different principles, both stating the wrong things that have been done and then the actions that this group wants to see in the future. So seeing all of that laid out was really fabulous. In the back of the book, there is also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it was really interesting to read about how this international declaration can go a long way in terms of human rights and actually securing these things when nations like the United States won't do anything. There is that international pressure there. I mean, in this it states the right to land, the right to language and culture, the right to education about culture, the right to representation. And another thing that I didn't really know that the book talks about is the military occupation of Hawaii, and it connects it to other Pacific places and other places that the United States has control of, and how that affects the larger colonial imperialist projects of, occupying other nations and war, but also how it affects the environment of Hawaii. Is destroying the land with testing different things for the military. So, it's laid out here and in the plan of the group of what they want to see in Hawaii, of a right to no occupation with military forces. It also talks a lot about tourism and the horrible labor rights issues in that field, and the way that tourism has used this image of Native Hawaiians to promote availability with the promiscuity of Native women and the use of the hula dance when really it has spiritual significance, when really these jobs are horribly paid with horrible benefits, and tourism destroys just the ability to live a life where other people that come from other places are prioritized over you. And I know this has affected Hawaiians' access to water and food, and it was interesting to see in this book in the 90s them saying, oh, by 2000 there's going to be no water available, it will have to be imported, and to see on Twitter in real time people talking about this and the effects of COVID on Hawaii and tourists coming in and spreading COVID and everything that's going on now. Also, when I was talking about the military earlier and the connection to other places in the Pacific, how Hawaii and other places become a dumping ground for the waste of the West. There's a whole section in here that talks about women's role in the movement for Hawaiian sovereignty, which I found really fascinating. And she highlights the role of different women in the movement, and actually, her sister is one of the leaders of the org that I've been mentioning this whole time. But one thing that Hanani K. Trask herself is very involved with in terms of activism is the way that Hawaiian history is taught at the University of Hawaii, the way that white historians and anthropologists have both depicted a racist version of history, with depicting Native Hawaiians as cannibals and savage, and how these white people coming in were civilizing the nation, and how late in the 90s these things were being taught in universities, as well as white anthropologists coming in and digging up bones and just having no respect for death and the spiritual practices of Hawaiians. And songs and oral traditions weren't seen as important ways to know history, when really they were central to Native Hawaiians' ways of passing on their history. She goes through the intense racism she faces in even trying to get hired at the university, and then her attempting to speak about Hawaiian culture and history in this way in the American Studies department, and that's what I studied. So it was interesting to see where this part of the field was in the 90s, and she was integral in getting a Hawaiian Studies department founded at the university. There's a lot of racial tension at this university, especially in a place where, economics and tourism are fields that they're training people for, and the professors are 75% white and students are 75% non-white. Yeah, I could go on talking forever. I think that I'm so glad I read a book about Hawaii from her perspective. I would be interested to see if she has any other writing, or like I said, now I want to delve more into modern issues in Hawaii and catch myself up from 1993. So yeah, I will check back in with the next book I'm reading. Hi, so the second book that I picked up is Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico by Ed Morales. And this actually was kind of the opposite experience of the other book I read. I thought that it was going to go from the point that Americans took over from the Spanish really through all of history to today, but really it just gave a really short paragraph about Americans gaining control of Puerto Rico and then cut right to a lot of current issues. I really appreciated that because there is so much that I learned from this book, but at the same time, I'm someone that does not have a lot of familiarity, and it is hard for me to understand financial things. So this book talks a lot about bonds and debt in Puerto Rico, which I thought was really important to read, but at the same time, I struggle a lot with it. I almost DNF'd this book a few times. I still feel like I didn't get what I wanted to read with kind of the history of American takeover in Hawaii. There was a lot about politics in like the 50s and 70s and Puerto Rico becoming a commonwealth, and how that status has been manipulated by the United States in ways that benefit it. So when Puerto Rico needs support and representation, it has struggled to get that, but then when the United States needs to benefit from that, it has in every scenario. It was interesting to read this after reading about Hawaii and, you know, the fight for sovereignty and Hawaii, the difference between Hawaii being a state and Puerto Rico's status, and how the status is certainly important and people are vying for all different kinds of things, statehood, independence, but at the same time, neoliberalism and debt and the sale of bonds in Puerto Rico has affected this process because it's destabilized the economy so much that it's hard to think about independence, but at the same time, independence is needed to get away from all of these areas of control by the United States. It talked a lot about the people that have been in charge of the government in Puerto Rico and how they've failed Puerto Rico. Like I was saying earlier about neoliberalism, how people in power were setting up deals to favor themselves and taking a lot of the money and hiring firms and people that were paid millions of dollars, and the debt just kept going up and up. And there's a lot of discussion about how to get rid of Puerto Rico's debt and how people have tried to do it. And, you know, a lot of the people in this book were looking into bonds and ways to draw outside investors in from the United States that was just putting Puerto Rico further into debt. And there was a little bit of discussion about movements to cancel debt or to prove in court that a lot of this debt was illegal and went against the Constitution of Puerto Rico. That was another thing discussed a lot, the status of Commonwealth and the fact that Eisenhower, in the aftermath of World War II, had pressure from the UN and the national stage to not be seen as, you know, an empire anymore. So how Puerto Rico became a commonwealth and had its own constitution, but at the same time, how this was all puppeteered, you know, by the United States and very much controlled by them. But yeah, it's interesting to think about this debt in terms of how irresponsible it was and what reparations are owed to Puerto Rico. And also, this book was written in 2019, though I was wondering, even reading it, how things were a few more years after Hurricane Maria, because the book talks about the hurricane and how it devastated the island, especially because, you know, with Puerto Rico being in debt, its infrastructure is horrible. And this also reminded me a little bit of a book that I was reading about energy in places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico and how disaster affected that. I'll put that right here because I can't remember the title of it right now. I remember from reading that book how they talked about people not being able to access power died because they needed that for their medical needs. And he talks about going back to the island, you know, where his mother was throughout the hurricane, and the mass devastation, but also the ways that communities were rebuilding and relying on each other when the government was not adequately helping people. It talked about, of course, Trump's response to Maria and how awful that was, and the relationships that politicians in Puerto Rico have with Trump. But it also talked about how predatory things happened in the wake of Maria. It talked about schooling in Puerto Rico, and how, I forget her title, the education person in charge was using this as an opportunity to push through a lot of charter schools in Puerto Rico, and where teachers are already paid horribly, and eliminating schools, and how all of these vulture funds were circling. And, you know, again, even though Puerto Rico's debt was declared unpayable, people are trying again to do the same thing that's been done in Puerto Rico for years. So yeah, it was very scary and frustrating to read, but I really enjoyed reading about the resistance, and I would like to read more about earlier on, because a lot of activists were name dropped in this book, but you know, it really more focused on modern movements and artists and music and culture in Puerto Rico. It did touch upon Lin-Manuel Miranda's relationship with Puerto Rico and how he brought Hamilton to Puerto Rico and the protests around that at the University of Puerto Rico. For a myriad of reasons were really interesting to read about. So yeah, even though I didn't completely grasp all of the economic language in here, it was clear to see the ways that Puerto Rico was being taken advantage of by players in the United States through a colonial context, through an economic context. And I'm glad that I read this book, and I already have other books that I want to read. So I would love to hear your recommendations if you've read any books about Hawaii or Puerto Rico or any other territories or places that have complicated relationships with the United States. I would love to hear that, and I hope to read more books like this in the future and kind of keep it as a series. A lot of these books are really dense, so it does take a while, but I hope to do more in the future. And yeah, thanks for watching.